Surely you've watched horror movies where people got lost in jungles among wild beasts, became stranded in frigid temperatures at ski resorts, or found themselves entirely alone in the middle of the ocean. But has it ever crossed your mind that such a scenario could be quite real? And the actual story far more nightmarish than just a film on a TV screen? It seems to me that life has peaked and everything will only get worse from here on out. I want to die. A 33-year-old man wrote in his diary, he was experiencing depression and didn't realize that the universe hears everything and might fulfill his wish to perish young. Imagine diving deep into the ocean, and upon surfacing, you discover your boat is gone and you're completely alone in open water dozens of miles from shore. This terrifying situation actually happened to Tom and Eileen Lonergan. Today's story begins in 1998 in Australia, Queensland state, in the rather quiet, cozy town of Port Douglas, a place renowned among diving and sailing enthusiasts. There are numerous beach resorts and hotels, hiking trails, and golf courses. The town's population is just over 3,000 people. In summer, Port Douglas is very popular with tourists because it's a gateway to the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef itself is an iconic location, unlike anything else in the world. It houses the world's largest collection of coral reefs, comprising 400 species of corals and 1,500 different types of fish. The underwater beauty of the Pacific Ocean is so captivating, it's simply mind-blowing. It's the largest natural structure on Earth formed by living organisms. It can be seen even from space. Its size surpasses the area of some countries, and it's recognized as one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. For most people, diving and swimming around the Great Barrier Reef is one of the most incredible adventures, filled with indescribable impressions. But there are also sad aspects. The fact is, this beautiful part of the world is also dying. Climate change is slowly depriving life and bleaching vast portions of the reef. Tropical hurricanes inflict enormous damage to the fragile balance of coral reefs. But human activity harms the reefs the most. And one day, this living ecosystem will vanish, and the world will lose one of the most beautiful places on Earth. The beauty of the Great Barrier Reef can still be admired. However, time is running out, and we'll never see it as Eileen and Thomas Lonergan viewed it in 1998. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. At that time, Tom was 33 years old, and Eileen had just turned 28. They were young, madly in love with each other, and absolutely inseparable. Their close ones even joked about how the couple did everything together, though deep down they envied such a relationship. The young people met when they were both studying at Louisiana State University. Thomas and Eileen encountered each other, fell head over heels in love, and soon married while still students. They were both born and raised in Louisiana and didn't travel outside the state very often. But they shared a genuine thirst for adventure and a desire to help others. For this reason, Tom and Eileen joined a volunteer program that sent Americans to work abroad on community projects and education. All this was done to promote friendship and cooperation worldwide. Thanks to their work with the Peace Corps, the Lonergans traveled throughout the Pacific Islands. They visited the tiniest bits of land with populations of just a few thousand people. But their main task was teaching children from low-income families on the island of Fiji. By 1998, Tom and Eileen had been married for 10 years. By this point, they had completed their Peace Corps mission and were ready to return to America. But first, they decided to take a round-the-world cruise to admire the most beautiful places on the planet. They planned to return home by March 1998. This is how the Lonergans found themselves in Australia, in Queensland state. Even during her university years, Eileen was passionate about diving. She liked it so much that she got Tom involved, and now they had become certified scuba diving enthusiasts together. The main purpose of their trip to Australia was the Great Barrier Reef. They had long dreamed of seeing the beauty hidden at the bottom of the ocean. Tom and Eileen loved spending time in nature. They often went camping, swam in the open ocean, or simply walked and admired natural wonders. On Sunday, January 25th, 1998, the weather was beautifully sunny. Tom and Eileen knew that their trip to the Great Barrier Reef would be their last adventure because their journey was coming to an end. The couple sat on the 26-seat Outer Edge boat, heading towards the Great Barrier Reef from the small town of Port Douglas. They had signed up for a one-day excursion along with other divers. The group consisted of people with varying levels of diving experience. Tickets cost 160 Australian dollars or slightly over 100 US dollars. For this fee, the 5-person Outer Edge crew promised to arrange 3 dives on the chain of shallows near the reef, located more than 40 miles from shore. Many different diving companies operated in Port Douglas. They had been in this business for years and knew the best and safest spots for diving, so travelers felt completely secure. The water on the reef was almost always warm, and the diversity of corals and marine life never ceased to amaze even experienced scuba divers. Around 3 in the afternoon, the group of divers was making their 3rd and final dive as part of the underwater tour. Tourists in wetsuits, equipped with special gear, sat on the edge of the boat and descended into the water backward. Once in the ocean, divers could descend to depths between 30 and 90 feet. Some simply admired the variety of fish. Others dove to the very bottom, while some swam around corals, imagining they were in an underwater garden. Each chose what interested them most. When dive time was up, a special signal sounded on the boat, indicating it was time to surface. This signal could be heard through the water. Divers emerged one by one and climbed back into the boat. Scuba diving can be very dangerous. There are many different rules to follow. Diving in the ocean without an instructor is not for beginners, but for experienced and certified scuba divers. To visit the Great Barrier Reef, one needs to train in advance and learn safety rules to avoid accidents. For example, you shouldn't dive alone or hold your breath. Surfacing must be done slowly, at the speed of air bubbles. If you ascend too quickly, gas bubbles start forming in the blood. This leads to decompression sickness, which can cause changes in blood vessel structure, disrupt blood flow, and potentially result in death. The ocean itself harbors numerous dangers, not all of which can be foreseen. Despite dive groups being accompanied by experienced professionals, life risks still exist. Moreover, divers have a limited amount of oxygen in their tanks, which shouldn't be forgotten. Professional diving tours and companies that have been guiding tourists for many years try to keep the situation under control, but much depends on the divers themselves. So, Tom and Eileen Scuba dived from the boat and engaged in underwater swimming. The Lonergans declined instructor accompaniment because their diving experience totaled 160 dives by that point, and the couple dove independently. They examined corals, admired the Great Barrier Reef, and were happier than ever. Visiting this ocean location was on many people's bucket lists, so this dive was likely amazing. Less than an hour later, the couple surfaced. They looked around and saw absolutely nothing but water. The boat that brought them from Port Douglas was nowhere to be seen. No other divers were visible either. Around them was only the endless ocean and more than 40 miles to the nearest shore. The couple could do nothing, couldn't call anyone for help, couldn't swim to land. The ocean is beautiful in photos or when you're spending a vacation on the beach, but being dozens of miles from shore, with only a terrifyingly vast expanse of water around and nothing else, is a situation frightening to even imagine, let alone experience firsthand. Additionally, the sea around Australia is home to some of the largest and most dangerous sharks in the world. The first couple of hours in the ocean didn't yet look like a deadly disaster because Tom and Eileen Lonergan surely hoped that Outer Edge Company staff would realize 2 passengers were missing when they decided to recount the number of tourists on board the boat, turn around and come back for them. But hours passed and no one returned. Of course, we don't know what the Lonergans were thinking and doing at that moment, but we can turn to stories of survivors in similar situations and try to understand what can be done to stay alive. There was one British tourist who found himself in stormy waters off the Australian coast and spent 40 hours there until he was eventually washed up on a tiny, uninhabited island. Luckily for him, this island was only 3 miles from the mainland, so he was soon spotted by a cruise ship and rescued. He actually thought he would die in the ocean during those 40 hours in the water. He was starving, freezing, and several times on the brink of death. He was just incredibly lucky. Miracles do happen, but not for Tom and Eileen. They were 40 miles from shore, and there were no islands around them that they could reach. However, the Lonergans were experienced divers, and their equipment included so-called buoyancy compensators. This isn't exactly a life jacket, because they wouldn't have been able to dive underwater with a life jacket, but these buoyancy compensators provided sufficient support on the water's surface, so the likelihood that Tom and Eileen could drown was quite low. The real danger came from the deadly heat, scorching tropical sun, and lack of fresh water. After several hours, the Lonergans still believed the boat would soon return. After all, divers exited the water, records were made about their dive depth, air levels in tanks, and other details, meaning a lot of additional documentation was filled out. Moreover, the most crucial protocol for such diving tours was that boat staff counted people after the dive, and before departing, they were supposed to ensure all passengers were in their seats on the boat. But on the outer edge that day, it seems no one noticed that Tom and Eileen never returned to the boat after their final dive. The 5 crew members on the boat were distributing food at this time, while the other divers discussed the incredible experience they had just had, and no one noticed 2 unattended diving bags belonging to the missing Americans. In fact, a passenger count was conducted, but obviously incorrectly, as someone failed to count to 26. More precisely, 1 couple was counted twice. As a result of this fatal error, Tom and Eileen were stranded in the middle of the ocean. Less than 5 hours remained until sunset. The most frustrating part was that not far away, about a mile from where the forgotten divers were, there were a couple of pontoons. These are essentially small floating surfaces anchored to the seabed. You can tie up a boat there and rest a bit. Tom and Eileen probably could have swum to them, climbed up, and waited there for help in relative safety. But this didn't happen. It's unknown whether the couple knew about the pontoons or if they could see them from the water's surface. It's not always possible to spot an object a mile away on land, let alone in water when you're constantly bobbing up and down. The powerful gusty winds in the Port Douglas area can be so unpredictable that the already strong ocean currents can easily carry you several miles away. So it's not surprising that the Lonergans didn't take advantage of this opportunity. One can only imagine what the 2 tourists experienced, suddenly finding themselves in the middle of the ocean. Most people in this situation would simply panic, though deep down, they'd surely hope for a positive outcome, that they'd be rescued, receive an apology for the oversight, and perhaps even get a small compensation. But apparently, something went wrong. All passengers and crew of the Outer Edge boat disembarked at the end of the day and went home, not thinking about Tom or Eileen. None of the people on board noticed that 2 individuals hadn't returned. This didn't happen the next day either. The Outer Edge crew, as usual, took out another group of 26 tourists to the Great Barrier Reef. The bags with the missing divers' belongings remained standing on the boat. It's unclear if anyone saw the abandoned items, but at least no one raised an alarm. Nothing happened even after a couple of divers from the new tourist group went into the water on the second day, and upon surfacing, told one of the crew members on board the Outer Edge that they had noticed diving weights on the ocean floor. The weight belt from the wetsuit was used to reduce the buoyancy of oxygen in the tanks. These diving weights were part of Tom and Eileen's gear. Apparently, the couple had unclipped the belt in a desperate attempt to stay alive. But even in this situation, the boat employee didn't consider how the weights could have ended up on the ocean floor. He just considered the find a nice bonus in the form of free equipment. The crew member didn't find the diving weights unusual or suspicious, and this was flagrant carelessness and irresponsibility. If he had raised an alarm, they might have started searching for the Lonergans. However, the Outer Edge crew calmly conducted standard dives, not even suspecting that somewhere nearby could be two divers they had left behind the day before. Tom and Eileen might have still been alive, drifting in the ocean waters near the Great Barrier Reef. But while they were fighting for their lives with their last strength and waiting for help, another group of divers was calmly enjoying the amazing underwater views in the same deep blue of the ocean. It was only on the third day that the Outer Edge crew finally realized they had lost two people. Tom and Eileen hadn't been seen since their last dive on Sunday around 3 in the afternoon. The boat's skipper boarded on Tuesday evening and noticed the unattended bags. This didn't worry him. He decided that someone from the tourist group that day had forgotten their belongings. The man opened one of the bags, hoping to find some form of identification to return the find to its rightful owner. But when he discovered a wallet and a t-shirt worn by one of the American divers on Sunday inside, the skipper noticeably frightened. This t-shirt was worn by Tom. The second bag contained his wife's belongings. 50 hours had passed since Tom and Eileen Lonergan were last seen. The Outer Edge skipper immediately reported the disappearance to the police. Law enforcement officers promptly checked the hotel room registered to the couple, and it was empty. Only then did they realize how horrifying and serious the situation was. The police called for backup even before they began the search. They simply knew their numbers were insufficient to handle a catastrophic situation of this scale. The number of police officers in Port Douglas effectively tripled just for this investigation. The Coast Guard and literally everyone who owned private boats in the town were enlisted in the search for the two missing tourists. Fortunately, there were also many volunteers among them. For several days, investigating the disappearance of the scuba divers became the top priority for all residents of Port Douglas. The management of Outer Edge hoped and prayed that Tom and Eileen would be found alive. Otherwise, they would face enormous problems. The crew members were well aware that they had been negligent in failing to correctly count the number of passengers on board the boat before sailing to shore. The amount of time passed since people's disappearance plays a crucial role. The more time passes, the less likely it is that they will be found alive. The first 24 hours are of utmost importance. Unfortunately, by the time the search for the Lonergans began, 48 hours had already elapsed. Everyone knew that their chances of survival were quite low, but people hoped for a miracle and didn't allow themselves to give up. The search area had to be significantly expanded because the ocean current could have carried the divers away over 2 days. 17 planes and 2 helicopters circled above the water's surface. Numerous boats and vessels sailed around the reefs. But with each hour passing without results, the search groups began to realize they were looking for 2 dead bodies. The ocean was so vast that it all seemed an impossible task. How to find 2 people in an area of 3 million square miles of deep water? The search teams were already losing hope that they could search all of this at all, let alone reach everywhere. 3 whole days of continuous searching involving the Navy and ordinary citizens were spent on the rescue effort. Then there was a small breakthrough in the case. A buoyancy compensator marked with Tom Lonergan's name was found on Crocodile Beach, 70 miles north of Port Douglas. Since the vest had no signs of bite marks from underwater predators, the search continued. A few days later, a fin was found, then a wetsuit hood, and a week later, the torn wetsuit itself washed up on the Queensland shore. Later examination showed it had been torn by corals. The diving clothes had become encrusted with shells, so it had been in the water for quite a long time. A theory immediately arose that this item belonged to Eileen, judging by its size. The wetsuit was sent for examination, and specialists were able to determine, based on how much the diving suit was covered with shells, that it had been in seawater since about January 26th. Eileen may have taken it off on the second day of swimming. Experts suggested that as the couple helplessly drifted under the scorching tropical sun, they became dehydrated and consequently delirious. Without any logical reason, they simply removed the clothing that was helping them stay afloat. There's also a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, which occurs when people are almost on the verge of death from hypothermia. Suddenly, they begin to feel intense heat, which is a false sensation. The body feels like it's burning from the inside, and people remove their clothes in an attempt to quench the burning sensation. In Queensland at that time, there was terrible heat. The water temperature in the sea at the Great Barrier Reef was about 29 degrees Celsius, and although it became cooler at night after sunset, the seawater was still warm, so it's unlikely the Lonergans could have gotten hypothermia. After this, the ocean washed ashore diving slates with Tom and Eileen's names. This was followed by their oxygen tanks, still filled with a small amount of oxygen. None of these findings had damage inflicted by marine life, so there's no proof that the Lonergans died from an encounter with sharks. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video. It's really important. Diving wetsuits have good buoyancy. Additionally, they help divers stay on the water's surface. If Tom and Eileen removed their wetsuits on the second day in the ocean, they unintentionally deprived themselves of an additional chance to survive. By that point, they were already completely exhausted and dehydrated, and their well-being left much to be desired. So it's unlikely the divers had enough strength to stay afloat for long. Eventually, on February 14, 1998, the police were forced to stop the search, believing the couple had died within a few days after Outer Edge abandoned them in the ocean dozens of miles from shore. After some time, nothing would remain of the bodies either, so there was essentially nothing left to search for. 6 months later, 90 miles from the disappearance site, fishermen found a diver's slate with a message from the Lonergans. Such wooden and later plastic writing tablets were used by scuba divers to communicate with each other underwater or make necessary notes. The writings on one side of this slate consisted of multiple scribbles about technical diving. It was identified that Tom made these notes, but on the other side of the board was a desperate SOS message, dated 8 a.m. on January 26th, the day after their disappearance. The message read, "To anyone who can help us, we were left on the reef on January 25th, 1998, at 3 p.m. Save us before we die." The Lonergans realized they had very little time left, so they used their last attempt at rescue. By this point, Tom and Eileen's families had already come to terms with the fact that they would never see their loved ones again. The Lonergans' bodies have still not been found to this day. It's unknown what happened to them in the last 2 days when they were lost in the ocean. Tom and Eileen were young and in love, and they had grand plans for their entire lives ahead. Now all of this has disappeared into the ocean depths along with them. Due to the discovery of various pieces of the divers' equipment and the absence of their bodies, various theories began to appear in the media. The most common and plausible theory was that Tom and Eileen Lonergan died from dehydration and exhaustion. For some time after death, their corpses remained floating on the water's surface for several days. It would take birds and marine life no more than 2 weeks to dismember and eat a human body, leaving nothing but bones. The bones sank to the ocean floor, where they were scattered by currents or covered with silt. However, not everyone believes this theory. Some still think the pair of divers fell victim to a shark attack, of which there are many in Australian waters. At the same time, they somehow forget to consider that most of these sharks are completely harmless to humans, and items like the wetsuit, buoyancy compensator, fins, and diving jackets washed ashore had no signs of animal bites. Again, it's worth remembering that besides sharks, other animals also inhabit the waters near Australia's shores. For example, many have surely heard about how the life of Australian zookeeper and nature conservationist Steve Irwin came to an abrupt end. On September 4, 2006, a man participated in creating an underwater documentary titled The Deadliest Ocean. The filming took place near Port Douglas on the Great Barrier Reef. Due to inclement weather, the crew took a brief pause. Steve Irwin, 44, decided to snorkel in shallow water and capture footage of an ocean dweller for his daughter. This occurred in less than 6 feet of water. Steve wanted to film a stingray as it swam away. Perhaps the creature mistook the diver's shadow for that of a shark and deployed its barbs. Consequently, Steve Irwin was injured by a stingray's spine, which pierced his chest and heart, causing a grave wound. Irwin's death is one of the few instances where people have been harmed by stingrays. However, let's move on to another theory about the Lonergans' demise. Some internet users insist that Tom and Eileen staged their deaths by faking their disappearance. No one seems to consider that the couple had no compelling reasons to orchestrate such a scenario. The Lonergans enjoyed their life and loved each other. They had just spent a wonderful vacation together before returning home to their families, whom they hadn't seen in 2 years. Tom and Eileen visited one of the greatest natural wonders of the world, following their bucket list. Why would they arrange a dangerous spectacle in the ocean over 40 miles from shore? No matter how experienced divers the couple were, they couldn't swim that distance independently, even if we assume something like that. Why would they choose such a complicated method to end their lives? Were Outer Edge Company employees involved in this charade when they overlooked the tourists' abandoned belongings and miscounted the number of divers on board after the dive? Of course, this theory is quite dubious. It emerged after several locals claimed they had supposedly seen Tom and Eileen following their disappearance. Some witnesses noticed a similar couple in a bookstore, while others observed the Lonergans checking into a Queensland hotel. These claims were investigated by police, but found no confirmation. There was also no activity on the couple's bank accounts, and their insurance policy numbers were never used. So it's more likely that someone confused the deceased pair with another or simply spread misinformation. Tom and Eileen left their passports and all their money. They had nothing to start a new life elsewhere. They would also have needed an accomplice to pick them up in the ocean and take them ashore. But all this is too complex to be true. Therefore, another theory suggests that the Lonergans voluntarily ended their lives. Such thoughts emerged when excerpts from the deceased couple's personal diaries were published in the media. 6 months before that fateful trip to the Great Barrier Reef, Tom Lonergan wrote in his journal that he felt like a student who had finished an exam. He sensed his life was complete, and he was ready to pass away. The 33-year-old man believed he had reached his peak, and everything would only decline from there. His wife Eileen was aware of her husband's musings. Entries in her diary indicated she was deeply concerned about her own well-being, knowing Tom's desire to die, but still wanted to remain with him until the end, no matter what. They had worked together in the Peace Corps and traveled together. Their lives were so intertwined that Tom and Eileen could hardly be called two separate individuals. It didn't appear that the man was actively seeking death. He was simply prepared for a tragic finale. However, the Lonergans' relatives completely dismissed this theory, stating that the writings were taken out of context. Port Douglas police confirmed that only excerpts that might support the voluntary departure theory were printed in the press. In reality, those who interacted with the couple before their Great Barrier Reef trip said they showed no signs of serious life issues. Nevertheless, The entries in Tom and Eileen's personal diaries spawned yet another theory. It involves intentional loss of life, meaning one spouse sent the other to the afterlife, then ended their own life. Whatever thoughts about death were voiced in the diary pages, the Lonergans' final message on the dive slate requesting help indicated their desire to live. The desperate SOS message is sufficient evidence to believe that Tom and Eileen longed to be rescued, but tragically perished from dehydration and exhaustion or drowned. While police investigated this case, another strange story surfaced. The captain of another boat claimed he visited the same diving spot the next day and possibly encountered the couple. According to his account, the number of people before the vessel's return to shore increased by 2. All tourists in his expedition that day were from Italy and spoke their native language. However, the captain insisted he heard several English-speaking voices. If his theory is true, it's possible the Lonergans slipped in among the divers and simply vanished once the boat reached shore. This theory could mean the pair planned to spend a night in the middle of the ocean, expecting another boat to appear the next day and bring them to the mainland. But this incident wouldn't have occurred if the Outer Edge crew hadn't been negligent that day. Tom and Eileen's terrible death led to the boat captain being essentially brought to trial. He was charged with their demise. The captain's role was to be vigilant and responsible for each passenger's safety. The defendant swore he ordered a crew member to count tourists after the last dive, but a fatal mistake was made. 2 passengers decided to take a final swim and jumped into the water during the count, though some divers later claimed no one counted them at all. They had a snack and headed toward the mainland. However, whatever happened, the Outer Edge captain was acquitted by Australia's Supreme Court in 1999. His lawyer presented the couple's diary entries in court, allegedly confirming a voluntary decision to end their lives. But Outer Edge's business wasn't so lucky. The company was accused of criminal negligence that cost 2 lives and fined heavily. Management had to file for bankruptcy because the fine was insurmountable, not to mention trying to rebuild their business after such a devastating incident. Despite the tragedy, there's a positive aspect to this story. Now, Australia has much stricter rules regarding people's safety in tourist diving. It seems humans only start taking their responsibilities more seriously after a disaster occurs. In 2003, a film titled Open Water was made based on the tragic events of that day. The main characters' names were changed, but Tom and Eileen Lonergan were the prototypes. The filmmakers recreated the horror of the couple's situation, left to fate in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, teeming with hungry sharks. To this day, 25 years later, the mystery of Tom and Eileen's disappearance on the Great Barrier Reef remains unsolved. They likely experienced a very slow and terrible demise, losing hope for rescue with each passing second. This is the